Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Carbon Trust webinar on understanding energy bills. Just to mention, first of all, that this webinar does form part of a series of Green Business Fund webinars, all of which can be found on our website and which cover a range of different topics and technologies. You should be able to see a questions box on your screen. So please do feel free to type any questions as we go along, and we'll attempt to answer as many of these as possible at the end of the presentation, which should only take around 30 minutes this morning. So first of all, just to introduce myself, my name is Graham Hunter and I work in the business services team here at the Carbon Trust. As a member of the technical delivery team, one of the things that I often look at with clients is how and what they are paying for the energy that they consume on a site or various sites, and this will be the focus of this morning's presentation. So here's the agenda for today's session. We will start with a brief introduction. Then we'll look at metering energy supply and why this is important. Next, we'll introduce the different types of electricity contracts that are available on the market and the different charges that may be incurred through these. Then we'll do the same thing with gas contracts. Then we will give an overview of how larger consumers may be able to reduce energy costs by opting into something called the climate change agreement. Then we'll look at what information it can be useful to provide to potential suppliers when looking to renew a supply contract and try to get the best deal. And finally, we will explain the services that are available through the Green Business Fund. And then we will also run through any questions, as I say, that come up as we go through the presentation. So first of all, by way of introduction, for anyone who's sort of maybe less familiar with the Carbon Trust, we have been around now since 2001. And we were set up as a not-for-profit organisation with a mission to accelerate the move to a sustainable low-carbon economy. We are independent experts on carbon reduction and resource efficiency, and any surpluses from group commercial activities are reinvested back into that mission. We are very much an international organisation, so as well as having offices in London, Cardiff, Belfast, and Edinburgh, we also have offices in South Africa, China, Brazil, Mexico, and the US as well. And there are essentially three elements to the work that we do. So these can be broken down into advice, footprinting, and technology. So we advise businesses, governments, and public sector on their opportunities in the low carbon world. We measure and certify the environmental footprint of organizations, products, and services. And we help to develop and deploy low carbon technologies and solutions. So Green Business Fund, which this webinar is being delivered under this morning, would fall under the advice element of the work that we do. So let's begin, first of all, by having a look at metering. So the majority of businesses in the UK are required to have what we call fiscal meters for gas and electricity. So these are just your simple mains supply meters, which measure the amount of energy provided. And from a supplier's point of view, the primary function of a fiscal meter is essentially just to collect information for billing. So electricity is measured by the number of kilowatt hours passing through the meter, while gas is measured by volume delivered to site. So this will either be in cubic meters or thousands of cubic feet, which will then be converted into kilowatt hours normally for the purposes of billing. At its most basic, good metering will provide the information needed to check the accuracy of the invoices that you are receiving from the supplier. However, it's unfortunately not uncommon to see businesses who are paying too much for the utilities, either through estimated bills or just basic errors in billing or accounting. So knowing and understanding consumption enables businesses to predict and account for their expenditure more accurately. And it's the first step to understanding what you're paying for. You will need to understand your metering arrangement. So, for example, do you have just basic fiscal or mains meters, or do you have more advanced metering like half-hourly metering, automatic meter recording, or do you even have some areas of the site or some say key processes, for example, that have actually been sub-metered, and what data are we able to see from that? So we'll now spend a bit of time looking at electricity supply contracts, as these tend to be the most complex, and then we'll look at gas after that. That's generally a bit simpler. But one of the first things that you will notice if you look at the electricity supply industry is probably just the sheer number of acronyms and technical terms that tend to be used. So on the glossary shown on the slide here, we've given a bit of an explanation of some of the most commonly used ones. And I'll talk through most of these as we go through the various contract types and associated charges as well. Hopefully some of these will already be familiar to you though, maybe just even from looking at monthly or quarterly electricity invoices. So first of all, just a very quick look at what you are actually paying for when you pay for electricity being supplied to the site. So the amount that you do pay for electricity supply to the site generally will be covered by most of the following elements. So the cost of the electricity itself, which tends to be less than 50% of the actual amount that is being invoiced. Government levies, so for example, climate change levy, the renewables obligation, or the feed-in tariff. Costs to run the national grid, so what are essentially transmission costs, costs to distribute that power, costs to effectively bank a level of capacity that may be needed at times of peak demand on the grid, supply management costs, and also standing charges and other small costs. For example, meter reading costs sometimes would also be part of an electricity invoice. So as we mentioned, there are many different electricity supply contracts currently available on the market, but generally they can all be grouped into the following four types. So first of all, a contract will either be fixed or flexible. By fixed contract, what we mean is one where, so essentially the amount that you pay per kilowatt hour of energy is fixed in advance based on the current market conditions. So this rate or multiple rates, bearing in mind that we could have, say for example, day and night rates, or even day, night, and evening and weekend rates. This rate or multiple rates will be applicable for the entire duration of the contract. Here, electricity can be supplied either at what we refer to as the customer terminal, so just at the actual site that we are dealing with, or at the grid supply point. So this would be the point at which the point of supply from the national transmission system to the local system of the distribution network operator. Advantages of this type of contract are that if the market energy costs increase, you wouldn't be affected by that. And also in the same way, it provides a bit of budget certainty, as you will tend to know both how much electricity you're likely to use over the course of that contract, and also the rate that you'll be paying per kilowatt hour of electricity. The main disadvantage of this type of contract is essentially that if the market value drops, then you are stuck with the original rate that you agreed to pay, so the rate that you're paying per kilowatt hour of electricity. That is, of course, unless you agree with your supplier to pay some penalties to get out of that contract, which do tend to be pretty large. The second type of contract that we see most commonly is what we call flexible contract. So this is where you would agree to buy the energy that's needed in small portions, which we call clips, and you would buy these at the current market rate. It is possible to purchase a clip that would be equal to the full amount needed for the contract duration, if this would be to your advantage. But generally, as I say, they are purchased in fairly small portions. And here the electricity would be supplied at the grid supply point. Main advantages of this type of contract are that you can take advantage of dips in the market price. So where your cost per kilowatt hour goes up and down as a wholesale price, the unit rate that you are paying would then change. By buying the clips, you can also change the volume of the electricity that you're purchasing as well. So say that sort of monthly or quarterly you expect to be using more or less electricity, then you can vary the amount that you are purchasing. Main disadvantage of this type of contract is that with it also comes a certain element of risk, that the market price will go up, and then you obviously just end up paying higher rates than you might have done if you had just agreed on a fixed rate contract. At the same time, sort of transversely to a fixed contract, it does also create potentially a bit of budget uncertainty, as you don't know what rate you can be expecting to pay for the electricity, as this will vary as you buy clips of electricity one at a time. So electricity contracts can also be defined as either all-inclusive or what we call pass-through. So an all-inclusive contract is one where all the planned elements are included, so there are no surprises when you receive your invoice. A risk premium tends to be built into the rate that you are paying, so this would generally cover any additional costs that the supplier might incur unexpectedly. So say, for example, if distribution costs were increased in the middle of your contract, then hopefully from the supplier's point of view, the risk premium would allow for that. If a brand new tax or charge is brought in mid-contract, then this would generally be passed on to the customer by the supplier. And here electricity is supplied at the customer terminal. so at the actual point of consumption. The other type of contract available is what we call a pass-through contract. So this is where pre-agreed elements of the bill will be charged to the customer based on what the supplier is actually being charged. So the main transmission cost here is something called the triads, and the main distribution cost is what we call traffic light charges, both of which we will look at in a bit more detail very shortly. And with pass-through contracts, electricity is supplied at the grid supply point. So before we look at any of the more complicated charging mechanisms that we've just mentioned, it's probably worth just taking a look at a fairly simple invoice first of all. So the one on the slide here is one which is for a fixed all-inclusive contract. This anonymized invoice shows information about the source of meter and billing methods that are in place for this customer. So one of the first things you'll note is something called the MPAN, or the meter point administration number, which you will see on any electricity invoice. This is also known as a supply number, and this is the unique supply number for this site, which will not change. So unlike, for example, a meter number, which will change whenever a meter is replaced, this, as I say, the MPAN number will be specific to that site. So this should also, this should always be the reference number that is used for the electricity supply to the site, not a meter number, as we've mentioned, which can change, or an account number, which can also change over time. And by analyzing invoices, you can understand exactly what is being charged per unit of electricity in kilowatt hours, and whether this changes at different times of the day as well. So if you have, say, for example, different day and night rates. Depending on the metering arrangement, you might have multiple tariffs. So with, for example, a higher cost per unit during peak times, like the middle of the day, and then a lower cost per unit at off-peak times, which sort of tend to be overnight. Beside the cost of energy consumed, the final amount on the electricity bill will also tend to include additional charges. So things, for example, like standing charges, meter reading and data collection charges, as well as government mandated charges such as things like the climate change levy and feed-in tariff charges on the units that the site consumes. So some of these can be seen on the invoice here. So for example, we can see £17.89 quarterly standing charge just for the supply of electricity to the site. There is a 0.568p per kilowatt hour climate change levy that is also applied to this invoice, and a 4.76p per kilowatt hour feed-in tariff charge as well. So as mentioned, for larger consumers, depending on the type of contract that has been entered into, other charging mechanisms may apply. So if we recall on the pie chart on one of the earlier slides, we showed that built into the cost of electricity supplied are costs for both transmission and distribution of electricity. With an all-inclusive contract, the cost of transmission is included in the rate. So this is something that you don't need to worry about. However, with pass-through and often flexible contracts, this is something that does need to be considered. Typically, a monthly estimate for transmission will be charged each month between October and March. And the 3 highest demand half-hour periods for the whole grid between these months are what we would typically term triads. And you'll receive either a bill or a rebate after, normally after 31st of March, for how much you owe or is owed to you based on how much electricity you were using during the triad periods. Triad warnings can be requested from suppliers, although this is often a chargeable service. But this would allow you to have some forewarning of expected triad periods, and would obviously then give you a bit of time to reduce your load or even shift the load entirely during these time slots. Another common feature of electricity contracts and invoices for larger consumers is a monthly charge for the district network operator to reserve capacity for you, and this is measured in kilovolt amperes or kVA. So this is where you essentially have a capacity reserved for you, and then you would get charged if you use more than the allowance that you have been given, as this could potentially disrupt the balance of the grid and then potentially even cut off supply to some of your neighbours. The charge for this does tend to be fairly significant. Normally, I think about 3 times the normal rate that you pay for the kVA capacity. So it is worth, when you are negotiating electricity supply contracts, certainly worth getting that right. As these charges are also non-negotiable and set by the district network operator and apply to all contract types in the same way. Something else to consider are distribution charges, which are often referred to as traffic light charges, as these are also included in the cost of supplying electricity. Again, with an all-inclusive contract, like the transmission charges, this is included in the rate, so it's not something that you need to worry about. However, again, with pass-through and often flexible contracts, this is something that you will need to consider. So at different times of the day, depending on the days of the week, you will be charged differently for power to be distributed to you. And these timings do tend to be different for each district network operator. At peak times or red times, you are charged the most. This tends to be between 5 and 7 p.m. on weekdays. And at times when the grid is at its lowest level of demand, these are green times where distribution costs the least. And similarly, you also have an amber band in between the red and the green. So with a pass-through flexible contract, you will be charged based on exactly how much power was being distributed to you during each of these time slots. One of the key benefits of this type of contract is that it is possible to reduce costs if you can load shed out of the red band into either the amber or the green. I use less power when there is peak demand on the grid. And for larger, typically industrial type sites, the potential cost savings associated with load shedding or load shifting can be fairly significant. The final electricity charge that we'll look at this morning is what we call reactive power charges. So if you have a low power factor, which is essentially the ratio between the real power flowing to the load and the apparent power in the circuit, which is visually represented here as a pint of lager, where the real power is the lager itself, and the reactive power is the head on the top, then you will be charged for effectively wasting energy. This can happen any month and typically is not really very expensive unless you drop below a power factor of about 0.9. If the power factor does drop below 0.8, then the district network operator actually has the right to disconnect you from the network. Whether or not that will happen will depend on the district network operator. And power factor correction is the main control employed for this, other than just balancing the capacitive and inductive loads at the site. So that brings us to the end of the section on electricity contracts, and we'll now move on to have a look at gas supply contracts. So as we've mentioned, gas supply contracts do tend to be a lot simpler than electricity supply ones. And all that usually needs to be decided and agreed with the supplier is the volume that is likely to be in the next contract period, what the volume tolerance is likely to be, and whether you will be held to this by the supplier or whether there will be penalties for going over or under the agreed volume, and also the unit rate that will be paid per kilowatt hour of gas. Most difficult things with gas supply contracts just tend to be making sure, first of all, that the unit rate is representative of market conditions, and that the volume that you are expecting to consume has also been reasonably estimated, ideally against previous year's consumption. And similar to electricity supplies, gas supplies also have a unique identification number. This is called the meter point registration number, or the MPRN. And similar to the MPAN, this should be the reference number used for the gas supply. Again, not a meter number or account number, which are likely to change over the duration of the contract. When actual meter data isn't collected, so for example by a remote reading device, a meter reader, or just by the customer readings, then the invoice will tend to be based on an estimated reading. And if this is the case, a bold E will usually be present next to the meter reading, like we can see in the example slide here. This estimate will either be based on past use, or more often than not, will actually be based on typical average figures for the profile class, which can obviously result in fairly significant errors in invoicing of gas supply. So clearly, estimated readings don't take into account things like any savings efforts that you might have made on site, or even any changes in routine that have been made as well. So to ensure that the bill or invoice is based on an actual meter reading, the very least you should really be doing is to take customer readings on site and then communicate these to the supplier for the purposes of invoicing. Customer reads can also be helpful in terms of being able to spot things like billing errors, which do occur from time to time. And the practice of providing customer readings to the supplier should also ensure that the business is paying the correct amount for utilities. Accurate bills based on actual readings will also aid monitoring of consumption and comparison of historical performance. And as with electricity supply, there are also a couple of acronyms and common terms that are used within the gas supply contracts. So again, we've just included a short glossary here of the most common ones for reference. So I understand the slides used in the webinar today will be distributed to anyone who has attended. So the gas and electricity glossaries will hopefully be quite a useful point of reference. We will now look at the climate change agreement and how this could be of benefit to some businesses. So as we've seen in some of the example invoices for gas and electricity, UK businesses have to pay a levy on the electricity and gas used to contribute to offsetting the amount of carbon put into the atmosphere when using or producing these. And this is known as the climate change levy. Sites are classified as energy intensive users by the government, and these can potentially apply to have what's called a climate change agreement. So this agreement tends to be managed by external parties rather than the company themselves, simply because the paperwork involved can be fairly complex. But a company with a climate change agreement will commit to reducing energy use by set time periods defined by the climate change agreement. And because of this, the government will then grant a reduction in how much climate change levy must be paid by that company. The exemption level is based on how much of the energy used on site can be attributed to the prescribed highly intensive activities. And the climate change levy is paid through electricity and gas bills each month. So if you do change supplier, then you will need to notify them if you have an exemption status, just to make sure that you are not double paying. And by having a climate change agreement, a company is effectively exempt from the carbon reduction commitment. So now that we've looked at the different types of gas and electricity supply contracts, we will just have a brief look at what information we need to be able to produce when renewing a contract or looking for a better deal with gas or electricity supply. So the key information to provide to potential suppliers has been listed on the slide here. First of all, where half-hourly metering exists, providing a table of the electricity used for every single half hour of the previous contracts will allow potential new suppliers to be able to estimate when power will be used in the next contract period, and that will then allow them to give a more accurate estimate of what they would expect the charges to be. You should also let them know if you expect to increase energy consumption over the period of the contract. So perhaps because you're increasing production or you have new installations on site. And at the same time, let them know if you expect to decrease energy consumption. So, for example, if you are implementing, say, some energy saving projects, or if you're even removing processes or equipment from the site. You should also inform suppliers of any required capacity changes. So, for example, again, if you expect production to increase, then more energy will be required at any given time, unless obviously energy reduction projects are completed. So this may mean that you need to increase the amount of capacity that you are being provided by your electricity supplier. And finally, if the intention is to install or remove any metering at the site, then again, you need to let the supplier know about this. Because even if you do stop, say, for example, using gas on site, but don't remove the meter, then you will still potentially have to pay the standing or fixed charges associated with that contract. So that brings us to the end of the section of the presentation on understanding energy bills. To finish off, what we'll do is just give a brief overview of the other services that we offer through the Green Business Fund scheme. So the Green Business Fund is available to small and medium-sized businesses, schools, sole traders and charities in England, Scotland and Wales. And businesses applying to the Green Business Fund need to meet two of the three criteria outlined on the slide here. So they need to either have no more than 250 employees, an annual turnover not in excess of 25.9 million, or an annual balance sheet not in excess of 12.9 million. And in addition to this, businesses which qualify for Green Business Fund must also not have more than 25% of their business owned by an entity which does not meet two of the three criteria above. Green Business Fund offers a range of energy efficiency training, generally delivered through 2-hour workshops, which are hosted across the UK. These workshops outline energy efficient behaviour and equipment to help reduce business and energy consumption. And the next available workshops are listed on the slide here. So these are in Loughborough, a couple in London, Loughborough University again, and Portsmouth throughout the autumn and winter of 2018. Green Business Fund also offers opportunity assessments through either remote or on-site visits. And these assessments will generally outline the top 3 cost-saving recommendations for a business to help it become more energy efficient and reduce their energy consumption. It also offers implementation advice. So for businesses that might be a little bit further along their journey, so maybe they have already identified the energy efficiency improvements that they want to make. This is a service where we can essentially manage a tender process, engage carbon trust credited suppliers, normally to visit sites and to come back with proposals and quotations, which one of our consultants can then evaluate and report back to the business on. The Green Business Fund also offers a capital contribution to SMEs. So this is typically 15% towards the project cost, up to a maximum of £5,000 for any energy saving project. So there are upper and lower limits explained on the slide here. So that the upper limit that we are allowed to contribute is £5,000, and the lower limit is 750, which would equate to a minimum project value of £5,000. And projects qualifying for the 15% funding should have a financial payback of under 5 years and need to be delivered by a Carbon Trust accredited supplier. The reason for this being that Carbon Trust accredited suppliers, which can be found on our Green Business Directory, are suppliers which have gone through a due diligence process with the Carbon Trust and have delivered projects that we have reviewed in the past. So this just gives us a reasonable level of confidence that energy saving projects will achieve the savings that have been proposed. To give a quick example of a project that we might support, so you could have, say, an LED lighting project which would cost £30,000 with a payback of 3.5 years. So this, if the company met the SMA criteria, would allow us to offer a capital contribution of £4,500, which would then reduce the cost of the project to the end customer from £30,000 to £25,500. Some additional services offered through Green Business Fund are our Virtual Energy Manager, which is a one-on-one tailored series of modules that would tend to be delivered by one of our consultants, again, via regular phone calls. And these would be used to help businesses identify savings associated with the energy management practices at site. We also offer a range of technical webinars, such as the one this morning. And as I mentioned, these are all available via the Carbon Trust website, typically 30 to 45 minutes in length. And finally, also via the Carbon Trust website, there are a range of publications that are available to SMEs to provide information on how to become more energy efficient. The Green Business Fund finally has also more recently been developing a carbon footprinting calculator, which is aimed at SMEs to help them to report their carbon footprint by entering some common emission sources, including electricity, gas, and fuel consumption. And this tool, again, is readily available via the Carbon Trust website. One final thing to flag is just that the Carbon Trust also manages something called the Energy Technology List. So this is a government-approved list of energy efficient products. It contains more than 15,000 products in 57 different technology categories. So, for example, refrigeration, boilers, motors and drives, heating and ventilation. And in a few categories, products aren't separately listed. So, for example, with lighting, there are simply so many energy efficient products available on the marketplace now that they aren't listed. But you could still potentially claim an enhanced capital allowance if lighting that you are purchasing meets the ETL criteria, details of which, as I say, are on the website. So what this means is that organizations that pay income or corporation tax can claim enhanced capital allowances, or ECAs, on purchases of ETL equipment, which means that they can get the tax benefit in the year of purchase. So, for example, the benefit to an organisation spending £10,000 on energy efficient equipment could amount to £1,900 in the year of purchase. So that brings us to the end of this morning's presentation. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you did find it useful. I'll now put the presentation on hold for a few minutes, and we will see if there are any questions which have come through during the presentation, and if there are, then we will come back and we will address these. Okay, so we have a couple of questions which I think are quite specific. So I will, I think what's best is if we come back to those maybe just directly to the individuals who've asked those questions. We will pick those up. One more general question that we've had was just on submetering. So someone is asking what the benefits of submetering are. So submetering is essentially where, in addition to your mains or fiscal meter, typically for electricity, you would actually have additional submetering at the site. The key advantages of this would be maybe if you have a site, say, that's a mixed-use site. So an example that I've had recently with one of our clients is where they are subletting offices out, and they wanted to be able to account for the different electricity consumption of the companies that they were subletting to. So that's where submetering could be very useful, in that you could actually monitor and record the electricity consumption of different parts of a building or different occupants of a building, which could either be used simply for charging that occupant, or could be used for maybe a bit of analysis, and trying to identify ways in which that occupant can try and reduce the consumption, especially if the owner of the building is actually paying the electricity costs. Another example of where submetering could be useful would be with, say, a manufacturing site where you have various fairly energy intensive processes, and you want to decide where to try and focus your attention in terms of trying to reduce the energy consumption and running costs at that site. It would be probably fairly sensible to submeter, as I say, either processes or areas of a site. And then you would be able to potentially identify, well, first of all, where electricity consumption is greatest, and then look at what savings could be achieved. With submetering, you would typically have half-hourly data available, which would allow you to look at the consumption profile, as I say, of either the whole site or different areas or different processes, which can often provide quite a lot of insight as well. So, for example, where we've got half-hourly electricity meter readings, one of the first things that we would typically do would be to look at the out-of-hours consumption, and quite often we see consumption that maybe we wouldn't expect. So this would be a first step in identifying things like equipment or systems that are left running out of hours, and we could ask ourselves questions about, do these systems really need to be running? Obviously, where you have things like servers, for example, on site, they obviously need to run 24 hours, but quite often we see various things. I guess the most common one would be motors, which are running out of hours, that quite often businesses just maybe aren't aware of. So half-hourly and submetering can identify things like this, and can quite often very quickly justify the cost of installing the metering through the potential savings that can be identified by implementing ways of either switching off or turning down equipment and processes when not required. I think that is it in terms of questions. As I say, there are a couple here that we will come back to people on individually. And also feel free to email in with any questions that you might have following the webinar. But otherwise, I'd just like to thank everyone again for attending this morning. Thank you very much.